I don't have to worry about having out-of-date political photographs from Australia, but of course I don't have a PowerPoint today. I'm just going to be reading from some notes that I have here. So I've been asked to talk about the political consequences of the coup, and initially I was tempted to revisit the events immediately surrounding the coup, but then it seemed to me as if this is very well trodden ground, and there's little new that I would have to say about that. And it seemed more interesting to place the coup in a broader political context, a kind of longue durée approach. And so I want to look backwards from 1965 as well as forwards to the present. And indeed, I think there's actually some overlap with Bhaskara's presentation. And I want to venture some thoughts on the deeper forces that created the coup and resulted in the killings, but also how the coup has shaped the subsequent half-century of Indonesian politics. The coup, of course, was a seismic event in Indonesian history, but it wasn't something just resulting from immediate events. It was a product of a much longer build-up of tension, suspicion, acrimony and vilification. And there's this sense of, this almost geological analogy here, this sort of massive forces butting up against each other, almost like tectonic plates, colliding, grinding against each other until eventually, with the coup, one of those forces ends up ascendant. And so I think our focus should be not so much on individuals, but some of these broader structural forces and interests. So when I look back from 1965, there seemed to me two key preceding events which captured some of these forces at work. And the first is the so-called Madiun or affair or Madiun Rebellion, 1948, and then the Aksi Sepihak or the unilateral land actions of 1963, really until early 1965. So let me begin first of all with Madiun. This is really, the critical moments came in September and October 1948. This was an uprising, as many of you will know, it was an uprising of PKI forces against the Republican government with support from the Socialist Party as well. It was forcibly crushed by the military. There are no accurate figures of the death toll that I've ever been able to come across, but most certainly many thousands on both sides. And in fact, I don't think there's really been a good historical account of this particular event. If anyone's aware of a good account, please let me know. But this event was interesting because of the way it triggered a cycle of mutual vilification between, on the one hand, Islam, Islamic groups, and the military, especially the army, and on the other, the PKI and other leftist forces. For the military and Islamic groups, the PKI rebellion was an act of gross betrayal of national interest, indeed at a critical moment when the Republic was fighting for its life. That the PKI placed its own ideological agenda above that of national interest, and thereby deepened the crisis within the country. More specifically for Islamic groups, the PKI was seen as undertaking a direct attack on Islamic scholars and on Islamic schools. The number of people killed, again, remains uncertain, but over time the estimates have been inflated by the various groups that have been recounting these stories. And it's taken on a much bigger, it's taken on a much greater significance. It was not a local event born of particular circumstances, but rather it was an attack on Islam itself, upon those pillars of the Islamic community, the ulama, the Islamic scholars. Masyumi, at that time, immediately declared jihad against the PKI, and this was supported by Nahdlatul Ulama's Ministry of Religious Affairs, who said it was a religious obligation to fight the communists, and the communists were condemned as atheists. So this fed into a much deeper discourse within Indonesian Islam, which saw the Islamic community as besieged. This had its roots not only from some of the Middle Eastern discourses, but particularly Dutch colonial experience, where the Dutch were seen as favouring the Christian community, which led to Christianisation campaigns within the Islamic community. And now the supposedly infidel Communist Party was replacing that threat of the Christians previously posed to Islam itself. We then come to the unilateral actions, which began in late 1963, and again we find this Medion story emerging again. Very much this view that if the PKI was not resisted, and violently so, well then Muslims and their leaders would be felled and their schools and lands would be overtaken. Interestingly, in this case, there was army encouragement, but very little direct involvement. I don't know if Margot Lyon is still here, but she wrote one of the best accounts of this. Of course, the Muslim parties won in these clashes against the communists, against Barisan Tani Indonesia, the PKI peasant organisation. And with this victory, the Muslims gained confidence that were there to be open conflict on a much larger scale with the PKI, that they would win, because they had shown greater determination, they were better organised, they also felt that they had the will of God behind them. And so this gave them confidence in the run-up to the events of the coup. Many of the slogans and the rhetoric surrounding the unilateral actions also had this Medion tone to them, that their struggle was moral, was divinely sanctioned, again had almost a cosmic tone to it. We then come to the coup itself, and the depth of the determination of the Islamic community and other religious communities for that matter as well, and also conservative elements of the army to destroy the PKI. This was palpable right from the first hours of the coup. And one of the views that was often stated amongst the people who were reacting to the PKI, what they saw as the PKI actions, was that there would be no more Medion events, there would be no more Aksi Sepihak, because the PKI had to be eliminated. And so the main target here was the PKI, not Sukarno. And many of the main anti-PKI players, of course, had plans for political change, and they wanted themselves to have a greater role in whatever political system evolved from this post-coup environment. But for many of them, targeting Sukarno himself was not a primary consideration. And this raises the interesting question, if we're looking at political consequences, is whether the outcome of the coup may have been different, had a few small things, components of this dynamic, been different. Robert Cribb's a great exponent or a great advocate for counterfactual approaches to history, and so this seems to me like one element of Indonesian history that's very susceptible to a counterfactual approach. So my argument would be that the political situation was extremely fluid from the 1st of October 1965, and Sukarno may have survived had he played things more astutely, and the dramatic nature of the political change that we eventually saw may not have happened were it not for his own hubris and his own miscalculations. So immediately after the coup, Sukarno's own position was diminished but not irretrievable. He still had significant support among sections of the armed forces, particularly the Navy and the Air Force, some sections of the Army. Many of the political parties had leaders that were still very well disposed to Sukarno. They were also wary of the military gaining excessive power, even taking over completely, because that posed a threat to their own party interests. And so, if possible, they were keen to keep Sukarno in place. But then Sukarno, over the coming months, made a succession of errors, and there's too many of them to recount in detail, but for example, that much repeated quote where he described the coup events as just a ripple in the ocean of the revolution, or words to that effect, which caused enormous anger, not only in military circles, but in many of the other religious circles of people who were at that moment engaged in wholesale slaughter of communists. He also attempted to protect the PKI members and suspected PKI sympathisers from the killing regime, the killing process, pogrom. This was not only due to his own genuine distress at the bloodshed, but also to his political need to keep something left of the PKI as a counterbalance to the army. He was also reluctant to purge the cabinet of communists and other left-leaning members, and also very reluctant to agree to the new economic policies that the technocrats were putting forward. With each misstep by Sukarno, the military became bolder and more assertive, and became more and more confident by early 1966 that substantial seizure of power was now possible because Sukarno was alienating people who were otherwise reasonably well disposed to him. And of course, and many of these people were despairing of Sukarno or increasingly hostile, increasing questions about what his own role had been in the coup. And of course, for Sukarno, the game was really up on the 11th of March 1966, famous Super Samar event where the military, by one means or another, had Sukarno's signature or something representing that placed on a piece of paper that handed power to Suharto. And of course, one of those many crucial historical documents that has gone missing and never been found. So the army had preponderant power within this system, but it may not have turned out to have been the kind of fully fledged authoritarian regime had it not been for Sukarno's mistake. So if we want to second guess history, this seems to me quite a good place to begin. The longer term effects of the coup have been immense. The demonisation of the coup plotters, and particularly the PKI, became the most potent weapon in the regime's ideological armoury. It became central to propounding and maintaining the spectre of threat, which was so important to the New Order's very raison d'etre. It was this impression of an ever-present risk of disorder from communists that justified the New Order's vast array of social control and surveillance mechanisms. The perfidious PKI, which had risen up in rebellion, not only in Medium, but again in 1965, had now been quelled, but could only be kept at bay by a military regime backing an authoritarian government. There are, of course, constant references to the PKI's revival. Any form of protest or unrest could be blamed on emergent PKI elements. This was an infinitely malleable concept. Bhaskara mentioned a few of them. One of my favourite is the Organisasi Tanpa Bentuk, so the shapeless organisation that the PKI had. And they are everywhere, but they are without form. And this is kind of a great script for a horror movie. You can just let your imagination run wild about this almost ineffable presence of the PKI around you. And so the New Order made much of this. Of course, it had its pet and putt programs, its sort of Panchasila ideologisation programs, and it used Panchasila itself as a straitjacketing of doctrinal discourses. There were also some of the other more insidious systems, such as Lingkungan Bersih, that everyone had to prove that they had an environment that was clean from any communist taint. And so these became very powerful weapons for the New Order. The legacy of the coup is still apparent today, despite Reformasi, and again, I'm adding to some of the things that were presented in the previous slides. Communism remains the only ideology that is banned. If you want to set up a political party, the only ideology that cannot be your basis is that of communism. Thanks to the Constitutional Court, you can have candidates who may have come from a communist background. School textbooks, after a depressingly brief period of open, contested discussion of what happened in 1965, have reverted to almost a New Order-like single version of events that blames the PKI. And so, once again, generations of Indonesian school children are likely to be discouraged from making their own minds up about what happened and will be force-fed one particular view, a view which vilifies the communists. There's also the denial of justice to the victims of the coup and their families, the intimidation and terrorising of NGOs that seek to represent and champion the rights of those people. We have major Islamic organisations that remain emphatically opposed to any state-led inquiry into what happened in 1965. We have the case of the Komnas HAM report on this, and some of the large Islamic organisations are often mentioned as very moderate and progressive in their views, such as Nahdlatul Ulama, held a press conference, and they rolled out some of the most conservative generals from the New Order period to say that this was all fitna, this was all slanderous remarks about the role of the military in the Islamic organisations. In fact, the military and the Islamic organisations had been the victims of the Communist Party. And so this was just last year where we had press conferences like this, and quite often the arranging of those press conferences, there was a white book which was produced, and that was written by NGO members within the NU community. And so the sheer strength of this anti-PKI feeling, of this anti-revisionist feeling, is something that certainly surprises me 16 years into this process of reformation. One last thing to mention is that atheism, nearly always equated with communism, remains in effect proscribed, courtesy of the 1965 blasphemy law. We have the reprehensible case of the young man in West Sumatra who was jailed for, I think, 4 years, Usman, for a private post about atheism. And so it is in effect illegal to be an atheist in Indonesia. And a lot of these things can also be sheeted back to the consequences of the 1965 coup. Now, I think none of these things will be changed anytime soon. Some of these major forces that have been at work in Indonesian politics are still shaping the nature of public discourse, are still denying a voice in mainstream settings to many of the victims of the coup and its subsequent killings. And it also demonstrates, so it seems likely to me this impact of the coup is going to stretch far into the next half century, and it demonstrates how selective and limited have been the processes of reformasi.